But I can see him getting more and more frustrated as the day goes on, where he sort of throws his hands up in the air, that sort of stuff. And by the time the second day comes around, he might be pretty fuming to, he feels like why should I have to answer these questions? I did everything right, etc., etc. So I think we could see quite a bit of bluster, maybe a flick of anger, perhaps towards the end as well.
Should we start with Matt Hancock? Let's look back at Matt Hancock and then we'll look forward to Boris Johnson. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, it felt like the kind of weeks leading up to Matt Hancock that lots of big beasts who were taking the stand had almost kind of made a decision to sort of try and blame Matt Hancock for everything. So this was like his opportunity to really sort of hit back and defend himself. Do you think he did a sort of reasonable job of doing that?
Well, I think he showed that kind of sort of typical Hancockian kind of enthusiasm, and he obviously claimed that he denied that he was a liar, and that kind of like very upbeat. He thinks that he basically says that the way that he acted during the pandemic, that was necessary in order to keep spirits up and to get the job done. You needed to have positivity. Obviously, we've seen people suggest that was kind of nuclear levels of overconfidence. I think Helen McNamara discussed it, but yeah, he defended himself. He obviously, I think what's quite interesting is he offered a bit of an apology, but essentially his apology was broadly saying that he hadn't been able to make himself heard, that he wanted to lock down earlier, that he wanted to do things, stronger things to prevent more lives being lost, and his regret is that people didn't listen to him. Essentially, this idea that he's actually this kind of the COVID Cassandra definitely came out of it, and he was very, as you can imagine, very defensive. Given that, as you said, we listened to weeks and weeks of people just kind of dissembling him and really taking him apart and making him a bit of a scapegoat for this module of the inquiry.
And of course, there's the whole issue of his affair, and there's a certain amount of sort of titillation over that. But to me, I felt that probably one of the most kind of serious moments was around the conversation around that decision about care homes and about not testing patients and putting them into care homes. I mean, when you look back on it, that was a sort of really key moment of failure, and lots of people so upset about that. How
Yeah.
did he handle the questioning on that, do you think, Alan?
Yeah, I think that was the first time we saw him probably be a bit more, admit to some mistakes there. I think obviously he's under oath this time, so he had to be very careful about what he said. And obviously he was being questioned by, there's a Casey there for the bereaved families, and kind of really got into that element of it. And he admitted, I think, for the first time, that protective ring that phrase we kept hearing was not as strong, not as unbreakable as he'd first thought. And he said that was because there was not the testing there in place to be able to do the proper testing before people were sent into care homes from hospital. And secondly, that there wasn't an understanding of how asymptomatic transmission really worked. But it was a bit jarring because on the previous day, he talked about how he thought how well prepared he thought that the UK was. So those two things didn't really sort of tally up. They thought they were brilliantly prepared, but then also there wasn't the testing in place to be able to test patients before they went into care homes, and that they didn't understand the way that it kind of worked. And I think that's kind of, it was difficult to marry those two things up, his kind of enthusiasm and his defensiveness, but also trying to sort of act a little bit contrite, given that we know what happened in care homes when that testing did not take place.
Yeah. And also at the time, the thing that I find difficult to buy all this was the big thing about the virus, which we all lived through in real time. The really scary thing about it was that people could be asymptomatic. You could have it and not show any symptoms, and that's why testing, was so important. And of course, there was also a lack of PPE at the care homes. Well, look, we've looked back at the week with Matt Hancock, which was a big moment. Now let's look ahead to Boris Johnson. Now, first of all, why has he decided to sort of pre-brief his testimony and pre-brief his sort of big messages?
Yeah, and I think probably the question that might be being asked if you worked for the Daily Mail would be, why have you pre-briefed the Times and the Telegraph, given that you're paid as a very handsomely paid columnist for the Daily Mail? You'd have thought that his column on Friday might have contained a nod to
Because
this.
I think you'll find, Alan, that because the Times is a fine newspaper, that's why.
That is true. That is true. I'm legally obliged to say that. Apparently, yeah, the Times are much superior. But I think, it was a bit of a surprise, and I guess this kind of pitch rolling, we always kind of see this happen, and I think it was kind of interesting that he getting this out there. But it's, the way you described it, the way Stephen Swinford described it, is that he's sort of going to admit some mistakes at the beginning, but then also use this phrase that he got all the big calls right, and we've heard this repeatedly from Boris Johnson. So it's not really a surprise to know that actually, when it comes to things like the second and third lockdowns, all those kind of things around the vaccine, he's going to say that they got those big calls right. That's obviously a highly contentious issue given the way we came out of the pandemic at the end of it. But it's kind of interesting to see that he's willing to sort of try and roll a pitch and try and claim
Yeah.
that that bit. I think that kind of that contrition, that kind of apology for what happened at the beginning, I think they're trying to use that to maybe mask the fact that some of those decisions later on in the pandemic, through that second wave, that so damaging second wave, perhaps weren't up to muster in
Yeah.
quite the same way.
Oh, definitely. I totally agree. I mean, it looks like the strategy that he's come to is, look, I'm going to concede an apology at the beginning and then sort of double down on some of the other stuff.
Yeah,
But do you know, Alan, the other thing that I think is really fascinating about this, it's sort of a bit rude to the inquiry to sort of get everything out first,
yeah,
because you are meant to come, but it sort of reminds me about what he did with the privileges committee, and that actually ended up getting him into quite a lot of trouble, because
yeah.
people, I don't know if people will remember this, he was due to be in front of the privileges committee and then kind of released this sort of big kind of document and was attacking everybody and setting out his argument, and that just ended up turning a lot of people against him, and he sort of broke some more rules, but also sort of got his arguments out, which is slightly self-defeating, because it's going to give the KC and others plenty of chance to sort of start working on arguments against his arguments.
Yeah, and it's sort of, I think, in its attempt to try and sort of spike the guns of the questions because he sort of pre-answered them. But as you say, in a sense, it gives more ammunition because there's going to be more questions now about this and about why. This part of the inquiry also is about the political process in dealing with these decisions. And one of the process might be about leaks within Whitehall or within Downing Street
Yeah.
that happened, around this kind of stuff. And he's just proven that these things can still happen even when one isn't an MP anymore. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of strategy. I think there's other people think that maybe he didn't leak it himself. Nadine Dorries said that, suggesting it was this shadowy movement again that leaked it. But I think it's pretty clear that it came from the Johnson camp, and it remains to be seen how useful it will be to both the Hugo Keith, the
Yeah.
KC, but also Johnson in defending himself.
Feels it's a bit sort of Operation Big Dog, isn't it? Sort of
Yeah, I think that one's long. That dog's long been put out to
that
pasture,
dog's
I'm
in
afraid. I
Battersea
think.
Dog's home now, basically. They're sort of slightly unloved and unwanted. But look, just before we get to the half
Yeah.
past news, now I'll let you go and enjoy your Saturday. What do you think? What Boris Johnson do you think we're going to get? Do you think we're going to get humble Boris Johnson? Do you think we're going to get full bluster, aggressive Boris Johnson? Are we going to get a lot of Latin? What are we going to get?
I think what's interesting is that because he's there for 2 days, and the way that he never likes that kind of forensic scrutiny. And like I say, he's under oath. He can't dissemble in front, in the way that he often does when he was in the chamber and would brush over things and respond. He's going to be really forensically kind of done. I think we'll see that contrition to start off with, but I can see him getting more and more frustrated as the day goes on, where he sort of throws his hands up in the air, that sort of stuff. And by the time the second day comes around, he might be pretty fuming he feels like why should I have to answer these questions? I did everything right, etc., etc. So I think we could see quite a bit of bluster, maybe a flick of anger, perhaps towards the end as well. But yeah, I think it's definitely going to be interesting to watch. This inquiry is going to go on for a long time, but these 2 days, I think, are definitely going to be remembered come the end of it.
So just remind us, Alan, what days is he up? Not, I was going to say in court, not in court, at the COVID
At the moment,
inquiry.
it's Wednesday and Thursday, I think, and then we're going to have Rishi Sunak probably the week after because it breaks up for Christmas. This end of the second module of the inquiry breaks up just before Christmas, and I think we will see Sunak the week after, which could be interesting given all the stuff around Eat Out to Help Out we've seen as well.
And it'll be interesting to see if Boris Johnson throws Rishi Sunak under a bus in any particular way. Well, it's certainly going to be very, very interesting.